Welcome to the Green Wasp Removal YouTube channel. Today we have an update video for the relocated Polistes Metricus nest. We've been documenting this particular nest since May of 2022 when it was brought in from the wild and relocated into captivity. This footage was shot on July 24th and 25th of 2022. This video documents some feeding experiments with baby Metricus wasps. These are native species in North America, usually in the northern eastern parts of the country. The larvae are typically fed by their mother through the process of trophallaxis, which is where the mother chews up the insect meat, as you see here briefly in this clip and we'll see later in the video. In this video, we attempt to feed the larvae directly by hand non-malaxated mealworms to see if they could function like other wasp species where the larvae will eat insects on their own without help from the mother wasp. For these experiments, we always let the mother wasp control the environment. In other words, we offer her the food first, and if she doesn't want to go for it, then we go ahead and feed the larva ourselves to engage in that experiment, but we try to include the mother wasp in that scenario. So we offered it to her, but she wasn't quite ready to do the feeding yet. As you can see, she sort of nibbled at it and didn't really want to engage at this point. And that happens sometimes. Sometimes she's just not in the mood to go when we are. So we tried feeding them ourselves, and sure enough, they were going for that. Mealworm is very fresh meat. It's cut into sections and it's fed to the larva or the foundress directly. And that's because it has to be fresh to replicate what they would do in the wild, which is collect caterpillars, typically, and soft-bodied insects, grab them live, cut them up, and feed them to the larva just like this. So we try to replicate that here. We mean no disrespect to any living being, including the mealworms. This is not being shown to you in a gratuitous sense. This is simply the nature of the way these creatures function. So since she dropped the other one, we offered the foundress a second attempt at a mealworm that had been cut up. But again, she kind of just nibbled at it and didn't quite engage. And she just wasn't ready to feed at this point. So we gently nudge her out of the way, and she's very tolerant of us. She's used to being in the habitat now for several months, and she's used to our presence in the habitat as we maintain it every day. So she just sort of allowed us to move her out of the way, and we started feeding the larvae directly. And it works. We see them immediately start taking to the feeding. They just start gulping down this mealworm. These tweezers are about 11 inches long, so forgive the shakiness on them. They're a little difficult to hold because they come in from all the way outside the habitat. This one larva just grabbed it and started just eating the whole thing by itself. The foundress just is busy grooming herself and allows this to go on, which is helpful because we did want to study how much food and how self-sufficient could these larvae be if given the chance. Well, it turns out they're quite good at this. So as you can see with this larva that's eating the worm, they have developing mandibles. They look quite soft and they're so tiny still at this developmental stage, but they're quite strong. As you can see, it's easily strong enough using the mandibles to pull that food, the soft parts of the worm, out of the harder outer shell of the worm and into its mouth. So it keeps doing this process and just eats and eats and eats. For this species at least, they don't usually eat like this by any means. Normally the mom will do all the malaxating of the food and then give it to them mouth to mouth through trophallaxis or just through handing the meat pulp off to their mouths with her own mandibles. There are some species of wasp larvae that do feed themselves insects that are left there by the mother wasp. Those are typically solitary wasps who don't live in colonies of different species than this. But these particular larvae of the Polistes metricus, this native wasp in North America, they normally will just eat exclusively malaxated food from their mother. So the big experiment here was, would these metricus wasp larvae act like the solitary wasp species if given the chance and just feed themselves? And sure enough, they will. This little larva makes that very clear. She doesn't mess around and tries to eat that whole worm all by herself. We kind of expected this from the first time we did this when she did the same thing. During that first attempt at feeding them by hand, we did not allow it to continue very long, just a few seconds, but this time we let her just do whatever she wanted to do with that worm, and I think she would have kept going until she emptied out that entire worm. The mother finally intervened and began to malaxate the worm, but it looks like, if given the chance, these Metricus wasp larvae will definitely eat on their own, no problem. We should note here that the larvae are actually attached to the side of their nest, so they can't crawl out anyway to go feed themselves, so they're kind of dependent on the mother bringing it to them. This part kind of cracks me up. The little larva that's eating this worm, she's kind of batting her mom with it, kind of whacking her in the leg with it, and the mother's kind of like, leave me alone, man, I'm trying to clean myself over here, you know. In a minute here, you'll see the mother finally become ready to help malaxate that worm for the rest of the larva, and she just yanks it right out of the mouth of this larva that's eating it now. So if you stand by till the end of this video, you'll see the foundress feeding her larva the way she would in the wild by malaxating up the meat pulp and putting it into the mouths of each of these larvae. It seems so far from our research and study of this nest that baby wasps are not very particular. They'll pretty much take the food however they can get it. So watch as the foundress starts to turn her attention here toward the larva and the worm. So here the foundress is finally ready to do some feeding, so she yanks it literally right out of the throat of this hungry larva, and she says, all right, it's time to feed the other guys now. So she grabs the worm and malaxates the worm and gets it into a pulp that she then feeds the larva. If you watch until the end of this video, you'll see the mother malaxating that worm and feeding it to the larva mouth to mouth in close-up, so you can get an idea what that looks like. But for right now, we're going to jump ahead a day to July 25th of 2022 when we fed these larvae some more mealworms. On this day, 2 of them ate really well. The others we didn't try to feed. We just let these 2 go for as long as they wanted to with these worms. And multiple minutes later, they were still both holding the worms and eating. It appears they can do this for a fairly extended period of time. We're going to show you this process in real time. You can watch how they use their mandibles, especially the one on the left is very visible. The mandibles working to pull the food into its mouth. It's focusing on the soft meat inside the harder shell of the worm, and it's simply ingesting that and swallowing it as it pulls it out. Now you may notice that the mealworms are still alive, as it would be in the field if these things were in the wild eating live insects, and that's an unfortunate scenario for the mealworm. We understand that. Fortunately, what research has shown about the lower life forms on this planet, such as insects and mealworms, there is no understanding of what they're going through at this point. There's no suffering per se, because they simply are not developed enough to understand what's happening, nor do they have highly developed pain receptors in their, whatever you might call their brain systems. They simply aren't developed enough. So please understand that as you watch these videos. We do try to be very cognizant of what we show on YouTube, because each of these videos we've produced and shared with you online are put up for a reason, and we strongly believe that the more people understand about the nature around them, the more they will respect that nature and the beings that they share this planet with, and they will understand how to conserve the planet better and treat it with a green, quote-unquote, green sensibility, where you have the understanding of nature to the point where you no longer feel okay with destroying it, poisoning it, using really toxic pesticides when you don't have to, and that kind of thing. And that's the whole concept around green wasp removal, is that we operate in an environmentally responsible, very conscious way, very intentional way of doing business. And the point of all these videos is showing you nature as it is. If you did not see it here, you would see it in the wild. And if you did not see it in the wild, you will never understand it. Therefore, the more you understand, the better we can all do as a race to protect our planet. Here, the cage that these wasps are in, the habitat we set up for them, got bumped. And because of that, the one on the left, the larva on the left, dropped its mealworm. Otherwise, I'm sure it would have kept it for quite a while like the one on the right did. As you can see, the one on the left, now that it has no food in its mouth, it continually reaches out looking for more food, continually goes through the open mouth process trying to bring more food toward it, as it does when the mother feeds it. And that's a good indicator that it's not done. It's been eating for some time and it's ready to keep going. The larva that still has the worm doesn't appear to be in any distress. It appears to simply be chewing and eating. Therefore, we believe at this point that this process is not only viable as a way to feed Metricus wasp larvae if the mother needs extra support in getting enough nutrition to a nest, for example, or if you have an abandoned nest where the mother is killed off due to predation by other animals or whatever else. Sometimes they just abandon nests in the wild. Regardless, this is a helpful understanding that if it came to the point where to raise wasps in a lab environment in captivity, we needed to feed them somehow directly. They can do that even without malaxating the meat the way the mother would, as long as that meat is soft and nutritious like the insides of a mealworm. That may be information that's important to this world when the time comes in the future where the great majority of wild species are either extinct or are so depleted to the point where it's going to be up to people in a lab, in a captivity environment, to help supplement the wild population by raising them in captivity and releasing them into the wild. That may become, in our near future, the only way that many animals and insects will survive. So the more research we can do on alternate feeding methods, viable forms of nutritional supplementation to a wasp nest that's been relocated from the wild or is being raised because this wasp is going extinct, that kind of thing, the more research we do, the better at this point. Here we bring the larva on the left, another section of mealworm, and she just gets right to it again and just starts eating without any trouble at all. It got to be so late at this point that we just decided to put the cage away for a while and get on with other business that we had to deal with. So I'm not even sure at this point how long they held these worms and kept eating, but when we came back later, the worms were no longer there and the larvae appeared to have been fed. We filmed this particular section of video for an extended period of time, and we're going to show that to you now in real time, just to let you watch the process here. So take a look at the foundress wasp at rest right now. You'll notice that her feet are tapping on a regular basis, and this is a wasp at rest. It's not uncommon to see this when they're not in very active mode, when they're kind of resting. We're going to punch in here a little bit and enlarge the image so you can get a better look at the mouth parts in action here for these larvae. Take a look at the mandibles on each side of the mouth. They look like small claws, and they will eventually be as large as the very large mandibles on the head of the adult wasp. But for now, they're still quite little, but so effective. Look how they work. The mandibles look more like sharp teeth in this stage of development. Later on, they become kind of more of an external tool to be used like a lobster claw to crush and malaxate food as adults, because adult wasps, they only drink liquids. So the chewing motion you see in adult wasps as they malaxate food is actually just crushing whatever solids they can crush in order to get liquids out of the solid, because adult wasps only drink liquids. They don't eat solid food. Whereas these larvae, as you can see, they're taking solid foods in constantly throughout the larval development. So their mandibles are sharp and claw-like to pull that food in, whereas as an adult wasp, their mouth parts develop in such a way that they have more tube-like structures that take over for liquid drinking. And that's part of the adult wasp anatomy that we'll show you in another video. So as we filmed this, it went on for about another 7 minutes, 2 larvae eating these mealworm sections. So if you watch in real time, it'll take another 7 minutes or so to get through this. And then at that point, we just stopped filming because we weren't sure how long these wasps were going to go. It was getting later. We had some other things we had to handle. So we set the cage aside and we just let it be. When we came back, half an hour later, one of them was still working on their section of the worm. That's the one on the right. The other one had stopped, or it had fallen away or something, or maybe the foundress took it away. And then we stopped back again an hour later or so, and both of them had dropped their worms or had the foundress take them away. We're not really sure because we didn't film it. So for now, you can just watch this over the next 7 minutes or so, and at the end of that, we will watch the malaxation of the worms by the foundress, or the mother wasp, who eventually took one away from the larva and worked on the mealworm herself, and then she fed that mealworm to the rest of the larvae who were not being fed by hand on these days. So you'll see her feeding her larvae mouth to mouth the meat pulp that she made out of these mealworms, and that's an interesting process. If you haven't seen that yet in our previous videos, take a look at it. It's pretty rare to see this up close like this in such a good, clean, well-lit environment. So take a look. In the meantime, we're going to hold the voiceover until this process is done. We'll catch you at the end when the foundress takes over and begins feeding the larva. So we're going to put a little music in here for you just as a placeholder so you know that there's no lost audio. As you know from other videos, we don't typically put music into our videos. We find that distracting, and it can be annoying sometimes for viewers to have music over what they're trying to watch. So we usually avoid that. But here, where there's no dialogue, no voiceover, no sound from the image itself, the music and sounds we put here will just be for placeholder reference. Alright, and we're back from the weird hypnotic trance music, and here you're going to see the Metricus foundress take the mealworm away from the larva who had been eating it solo, and she's going to malaxate this worm and share it with the rest of the larva. So you see she just pulls that worm right out of the mouth of this larva, and now she's going to malaxate it, which takes a few minutes. So what we're going to do in a moment here, we'll go into warp speed and watch this in fast forward. So you'll see this in fast motion for the next 20-25 seconds. I'll just hold the voiceover during that period. I'll catch up with you when it comes time to feed the larva. So there's going to be no sound here for a few seconds. So here we are back in real time. She's just finishing up now with the malaxation process, and you're going to see her start to feed the larva. She just leans down and directly puts it in their mouths as she holds it in her mandibles and continues to malaxate it a little bit. Each larva gets a little taste, and this process here of mouth-to-mouth feeding is exactly what they do in the wild. She gives the smallest portions to the smaller larva, and then she comes over and she feeds the largest portions to the largest larva. What she's trying to do is make sure that the largest larvae survive, because she needs their help to expand the colony. So one of the smaller ones in the back here will get a bite, but it's a much smaller bite than she'll give to the larger ones up toward the top of the frame on the left. So this larva got a huge chunk of food and just gulped it right down. Basically that larva ate all the rest of the food. And so what the foundress is trying to do is get that larva into the pupation stage and into the adult wasp worker stage as soon as possible, so that she can get help maintaining this colony for future generations that they're going to raise in this nest. So here she's all done and starting to clean up, and that will bring this video to an end. Stay tuned for more on this channel as we offer future updates about this nest throughout the wasp season in 2022. We're monitoring several nests this season that we'll keep doing updates with, both in the wild and in captivity. We hope you enjoy the footage. Wasps are pretty fascinating creatures. When you get up close and personal with them, you tend to learn more than you ever knew before. So that's what we're trying to do here on this channel. Thanks again for taking part, for liking and subscribing. That's been great to see the response so far, and we'll continue with it as best we can. Thanks for visiting. Have a good one.